Okay, welcome to the morning session on correlated pseudorandomness. I guess we'll have two talks here. So we'll start with correlated pseudorandomness from hardness of quasi-Abelian decodings by Maxime Bombard, Geoffrey Coteau, Alan Corbier, and Clement Gurko, and Clement will your talk.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So, I'm going to this work. Work with Maxime Bombard. So I don't rely on myself. So this talk is going to be about MPC. So I think that you probably know, but MPC is a set of techniques that you can imagine in order to compute a function over secret information without reading the secret input. And I want to start this talk by explaining you the importance of random correlations in MPC. And so what do I mean by random correlations? I mean that a trusted dealer will come and give you additional information, additional inputs. So it will give alpha to Alice and beta to Bob. And so when I say correlation, maybe it's a little bit unclear, but you can imagine that I mean obvious transfer, for example. So I give A0, A1 to Alice and B, AB to Bob. I can also mean obvious linear aggregation, where you give U and V two elements to Alice and a linear combination to Bob, delta and delta U plus V. This can be also rewritten in this form, and this is what we will use later. And so why do we care about these correlations? You can imagine plenty of others, but these two are very important because, in fact, if you have as many OLEs as there are implication gates in your arithmetic circuit, the arithmetic circuit's representation of the function you want to compute, then there exists very efficient secure multi-party computation protocols to do that. And this motivates the idea that we want as many OLEs there are multiplication gates in your circuits. The problem being that in common standard function you want to compute, the number of multiplication gates will be in billions, so very large number. Therefore, we want a way in order to generate OLEs in a very efficient way because we want to produce many. And this motivates the idea of pseudo-random correlation generator, which in fact is a little bit in the same flavors as a pseudo-random generator. We will start from little randomness to obtain a long amount of pseudo-randomness. Here we will start from short correlated seeds, and the parties will be able to silently expand the little seeds into very long pseudo-random strings. So when I say silence, I mean without communication, which is really important because for a long time this was the bottleneck. And because of that, this the MPC with preprocessing was born, where in the first phase the parties will create this pseudo-randomness, and in the second phase they will use this pseudo-randomness into very fast, efficient protocols. So please note that here the players can conduct this phase of preprocessing ahead of time. They don't have to know X nor Y nor F, and therefore it can be very practical because the first phase is constrained to do some efficiency, but you can just do it before the computation. There's some state of the art about Silent PCG. So I put here some of the recent works about the software. One of those is the next talk, I believe. But today I want to tackle mostly OLEs. So in OLEs, state of the art is a little bit less arty, to say. The most recent work was, the best work was done by Yevgeniy Dodis, based on ring syndrome decoding, but it suffers from a very bad limitation about the size of the field the OLEs were produced. And so in this work, we propose a method in order to improve this constraint, I mean, to reduce the Q. And so we prove that we can have an OLE have a PCG for producing OLEs for Q split 3. So I want also to emphasize the fact that these instructions are also entering a very nice property, that's the programmability property, which says in essence that you can program some part of the correlation that you will obtain. Meaning that, for example, if Alice is doing two OLEs with Bob and Charlie, she can fix some parts of the correlation she obtains. So, for example, here you can see that it is the same U. This is very important because if you can create some OLEs with this kind of shape. After that, you can obtain multi-party computation and PC from 2PC, and you can obtain malicious security from semi-honest security via some simple protocols. So now I want to give you the flavors of what was the previous work, how was the previous work working. And so the idea of Boreto was that if you take a polynomial P that splits into n different linear factors, and you take the ring FQ of x divided by P of x, because of the Chinese remainder theorem, it splits into n different copies of FQ. It is isomorphic to that. And so if you can create one OLEs over it, then you can obtain n different OLEs. The problem, as I told you before, is that because you want the polynomial to split, you have a condition on the side of FQ, which should be superior to n. Therefore, it is only working for a very large field because, if you can remember, we want to produce n OLEs in the end, meaning that we want n to be in billions, and therefore the size of the field should be also in billions. The other problem was mostly something like we were wondering about the conditions on B because it was maybe unclear which P should be chosen. Therefore, we come with a new assumption called the Quasi-Abelian Codes assumption. It comes with a lot of possible instantiation and a security which is, we believe, stronger and clearer. And we will do something similar in the big picture. By that, I mean that we will look for a structure that will be that will support fast operation in order to create the OLE on it. That will be isomorphic to n copies of FQ again, to do the same idea at the end, and we will have a canonical notion of sparsity because we will, as you may have seen, every time we based on syndrome decoding, and therefore we want to have some notion of sparsity. So going on, I'm going to explain you this assumption, and therefore I'm going to explain you what is Quasi-Abelian codes and group algebra. So we define a group algebra, FQ of G, for a group G finite and abelian as a set of all the formal sums. And I give you here two examples. So one is for the trivial group, G is just one element. Then it is just isomorphic to f of FQ. And if you take G to be the cyclic group, then it is isomorphic to FQ of x divided by x to the power n minus 1. And you can generalize. Here you can see that the isomorphism is simply from G to from the element of G to the power of x. So since you have defined FQ of G, you can easily define a matrix over it and define some codes in the standard way by saying that the code is a set of all the different code words. And again, some examples. If you take the trivial group, then any linear code is a quasi-G code. And if you take G to be the cyclic group, I put here some example. In the case of just one row and two columns. So here, this is just an element of FPG, and this is another one. But as I display the matrix over FQ, it's a second block. So now I can define the Quasi-Abelian syndrome decoding assumption, which comes in the standard flavors of syndrome decoding assumptions. You have a target weight T, and you say that it is hard to distinguish between two distributions, D0 and D1, where D0 is two random elements of FQG, and D1 is a random element plus paired with A, E1, E2, where EIs are random elements, but with the target weight. So here you can see what I mean by canonical notion of sparsity, because the sparseness is given by the fact that in FQG you can have a canonical notion given by the element of the group. So we can, in fact, rewrite the D1 distribution in this way if you want to have the code vision in a clear way. So we can imagine that we want to distinguish this from a random element of FQG, knowing H. And so how can we, in fact, ensure that it is secure? To do that, we will use the linear paradigm introduced by Ball et al. In 20. And this framework consists of saying that if I send the matrix H to the adversary, and I let the adversary unbounded time in order to do some linear operation over the matrix, and if the adversary chooses a vector V, the adversary wins if VHE is significantly biased too often. So this is the definition of linear attacks, but why do we care about them? We care about them because most of the attacks known in the literature against random decoding are in fact entering this framework of linear attacks, and the few that are not entering the framework can be dealt with separately. Therefore, we want to show that VHE in our setting is non-biased. Because E is a sparse vector, it's boils down to showing that VH is not biased. And in fact, if you can say that the linear distance of the code generated by the rows of H is big enough, then you will be able to show that VH is not biased, and therefore you will ensure the security. And that is what we have done. Because of a result of Fanelin of 2015, which says that if you have a sequence of Quasi-G code whose number of blocks L is going to infinity, then the minimal distance is also growing linearly. So this is an asymptotic result, as it is often the case in code, but it gives you some insight of what we want. And so I want to precise here that, in fact, the case of Fanelin is this one, where the number of blocks is going to grow, and by that, the linear distance. But what we would like at the origin was that we will just have 2 blocks, and the size of the blocks is going to be larger. So this is not what we obtain in the end. We can just this is enough for us, but for our efficiency measure, it would be proper to have this instead. But this is out of the scope of the paper for now. So going forward, I'm going to explain you how can we instantiate our group algebra in order to have the isomorphism of a lot of copies of FQ. So we choose G to be a product of Z divided by Q minus 1Z. And therefore, it is isomorphic to T different copies of FQ, T being Q minus 1 to the power of N. Now, it just only remains to create a single OLE over it. And how to create a single OLE over it? As you may remember in the beginning, I said that an OLE is I give an element to Alice, an element to Bob, and a sharing of the product of the two. That it is a sharing. So Alice and Bob can create U and delta as it follows. You take some E0, E1 sparse, A public random, and U is A E0, 0 with E01, and same for delta. Therefore, it's Q, the code of the Q is the assumption. They appears to be random. But if you take the product, U delta, Then, in order to obtain an additive sharing of that, you just have to have an additive sharing of the products I put in red here. But the products I put in red here are in fact products of sparse elements of FQG and therefore are also sparse elements. And we know how to produce additive sharing of sparse elements because of function sequence sharing, which is a primitive introduced by Ball, Dubois, and Ishai in 2015, which says that if you have functions that are mainly zero, then you can split it into two different functions in a single way. Therefore, we can use it and obtain a single OLE over FQG. Because of the isomorphism, we obtain n different OLEs over we obtain t different OLE over FQG. So some general remarks. All the different computation in FQG can be accelerated using generalized FFT. You may have noticed also that this construction is working only for Q split 3. We were a bit surprised at the beginning, but the construction fails when Q is equal to 2. We have a problem because if you take F2 to the n, then there exists only one invertible element, and therefore it is a group algebra only in the trivial case n is equal to 1, which is of no interest. There are plenty of different implications in MPC because of the work, mainly the fact that we achieve the first efficient and practice silent secure computation protocol for general circuits over FQ. So not Q is equal to 2, but it's improved the previous result. And finally, some different open and problem on questions. As I said, we have the efficiency of the protocol is strongly related to the efficiency of the FFT. So if we can improve the generalized FFT for over FQG, then we will improve the efficiency of our construction. This is, by the way, the only difference between these constructions and the previous one. The previous one enjoy maybe more efficient and optimized FFT than ours. There is also the work of Vanillin, which may be improved to fit what we want in a better way, as I mentioned. And there is still the question of Q is equal to 2, which we try to investigate further, but for now we are not having some nice results, so it is still an open question. So this is the end of my talk, and I thank you.
Any questions?
So I still have, I guess, 2 questions about the assumptions.
Yeah.
Extend the assumptions sort of in this moment of A,
Yeah.
So A tends to so also going to the form where E1 is uniform random instead of so our general is some sort of final subdivisions. So like the reduction is going to so such a similar
I'm not sure. I think yes.
Another question is about the so the splitting attacks in
Yeah. So it doesn't apply directly because so you mean that like when doing the previous work? Yeah. So the thing is, so here we are all the cases that were problematic in the previous work are in fact not entering into this model. So here we move from, you can see that here we are mostly in the same case as before, but here we are in multivariate mode, and therefore we have more degrees of liberty. This is one of the reasons we resist. And also, if we tried some techniques of foldings, everything like that, because of the fact that the noise is growing exponentially, it doesn't like, we have some arguments to say that we trust it. Even if it's not, maybe there is something, but at least.
Okay, guys. No questions here, no questions in the chat. So let's send Clement. Yes, okay. Yeah, I'll start in 1 minute to make sure people come in. So now enjoy the sponsors. I think we're close enough. I'll spend half a minute introducing the speaker, I guess, and get to 9:25. All right, so the last talk of the session is on expand convolute codes, pseudorandom correlation generators from LPN. And the speakers are Srinivasan Raguraman, Peter Rindel, Tito Tanguayan. Sorry if I mispronounced it. So Peter will give a talk.
Thank you. Yes, start. Yes, so I will be giving this talk, and as motivation, this work is motivated by being able to do fast mole correlations and with these transfer correlations. Unlike the previous talk, this work doesn't work over OLE correlations for larger fields, but it does work with the binary case. There's compilers. But yeah, so what is a vol correlation? So it's you get two-party functionality typically, and parties get out these A, B, C, and delta values, where delta is a scalar, and the rest of them are these random vectors, possibly over a field of some sort. And the correlation is that A times delta equals C minus B. You kind of think of C and B as secret sharing of this scalar vector product. And from this, that's vol. You can also compile this down to avoid this transfer and OLEs for binary case. Yeah, and what's really nice about this sort of whole line DCGs is that it has this it's called silent setup. And here, as we just saw in the last talk, there's some sort of succinct protocol that you can run back and forth during the setup phase, and you get out these succinct keys. And then these keys can be locally expanded without any interaction to get your desired correlation. Yeah, and the communications like security parameter can log the correlations you want. So that's awesome for MPC. So what's sort of vaguely, how does this all work? Well, this first setup phase is called lots of different things: function secret sharing, point functions, function PRFs, whichever you want to call it. The output of this sort of phase is almost exactly what we want. We have delta B prime C prime, which are just uniformly random vectors. The catch is that one of the vectors, A prime here, is like almost all zeros. It's super sparse, but the non-zero locations are uniformly random. And so what we want to do is sort of compile this sort of setup sparse correlation down into our desired correlation. So yeah, it follows the current thing we want, but it just has this sparsity property. So how do we get rid of this? Luckily, like everything here is like linear, so you can apply one of these linear assumptions. In particular, we can apply the LPN assumption, also called, like in this case, syndrome decoding. And the idea here is you pick like a random looking matrix G, and you multiply these from the left by G, and for the random matrices, you just get shorter random matrices. It's not too hard to see. But the magic is that for this A prime vector, sparse, you can compress it maybe by a factor 2. And what you get as the result is a uniformly random according to the syndrome decoding LPN assumption. So that's sort of the generic formula. Yeah, so in MPC, right, we don't just want one correlation. Typically, these circuits can get quite big. And so we want like millions of these correlations. And so in this case of millions, how big would a random G be? Well, it'd be order of, it's order of million by order of million. So matrix vector multiplication is quadratic time. And so in the classic sense, you'd get whatever time it is, trillions. So not very efficient and definitely not useful for practical MPC. And so what basically everyone's been doing in this area is to find a custom matrix G that gives you fast multiplication, but is also secure in the LPN syndrome setting. Some works, like the previous one, require extra properties out of this G matrix, but in our case, we just need fast multiplication and like the basic version of secure. So what exactly do we want? So we have the sparse vector E, and when multiplied by G, we want the result to just look random. Okay, so that's pretty simple, I guess. And yeah, so how would you go about proving that this is, or arguing that this is secure? Like what properties would you want out of a G? Well, there's been numerous people working on this problem for quite a long time, and there's been a whole, cottage industry of attacks that people come up with, and many more. But I guess one nice observation that some of the previous works have made is that is this sort of linear attack framework, or linear test framework. I guess we also heard about it in the previous talk, is that essentially all these attacks, with a few exceptions, follow this paradigm where you can recompile whatever they're doing to having the adversary generating this test vector V, and then the distinguishing power of the adversary is simply doing the inner product between V and R. And so there are some exceptions to this test framework, in that, like, if the code has like strong algebraic properties, good example is Reed-Solomon codes. Don't use those. But assuming you don't have these like extra structure that allows for some sort of algebraic attack, this seems to be the right definition of security. And so Okay, so if what we're concerned with is these linear attacks, then it's actually not so hard to get like a strong security guarantee. In particular, if you view G as an error correcting code, as a generating matrix for one, then if that code has high minimum distance, i.e. it's like a good code, then you can provably resist these linear attacks. All these are previously ordered attacks simply need on them. And so this gives us a formula for how to come up with a code. We want a code with high minimum distance. We want the matrix vector product to be very efficient, and it should also work over a large dimension, say order of a million. So, well, when you start, we have our criteria. Can we sort of narrow down what our code might look like? Well, the high minimum distance property that we need immediately says that this G matrix must be dense. An easy way to see this is let X be a message, and then for unit vectors of X, each row of G will be a code word. And the way we're going to sort of characterize minimum distance is the lowest weight code word that the code generates. And so each row of G will be a code word. And so therefore, it's pretty easy to see that G must be dense. And that immediately rules out any way to do sort of naive matrix vector multiplication. And so we need some sort of special structure so that we can do this matrix vector multiplication some other way. And so one way to view this is that, I mean, there's different techniques for different codes, but the technique we take is instead of viewing G as a monolithic matrix, you can decompose G into several sort of linear number of steps, and say each one of these steps can take linear or constant time. And instead of doing matrix vector multiplication as a whole, you do a sequence of matrix vector multiplications where each of these is only requires constant work. Constant work ends up being pretty hard to achieve. While you can do it in theory, in our codes we actually relax this a little bit and require or allow each one of these update steps to take like log n time. And so overall, we won't get a linear time encoding. We'll get like n log n, but really what we're optimizing here is the concrete running time. So this is fine by me. Okay, so what are these M matrices? Well, yeah, there's a bunch of options out there, and we're sure of what it could be. But in this work, sort of in the title, we're going to use this thing called a convolution. And what is a convolution? Well, in this context, the ith convolution, it will update the ith element of our vector x. And the way it updates it is it takes a linear function over the previous s positions. So s here is like 40 or log n, something like that. So we take a random linear combination over the previous positions and we add it to the current position. And we don't just do this sort of in isolation. We take a sliding window over this vector. And this sliding window has this like sort of curious property is that, and then it's like recursive, like the previous update affects the next update and affects the next update. And so we get sort of this like recursive feedback loop. So what's an example? So say our input is like 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, and then followed by zeros. Then when you do the sliding window convolution of this, of course, it'll be 0 up until the first one, and 1. And then from then on, you'll get some sort of sequence of zeros and ones. And because of this sort of recursive structure, typically the one sequence will continue after the first one. Another way to look at this, if you want more of an algebra approach, is that this G, if you just take it to be all these matrices combined, will be an upper triangular matrix that looks so much right. I guess the issue with just doing it as this matrix is that you would think like once the output becomes non-zero, it should just sort of stay non-zero. but this is actually not the case. There's actually some hidden structure here. And one way to view this is that imagine you're going through this convolution and your state window, this window, sliding window that we're looking at, happens to become all zero. Then from then on, of course, 0 plus 0, that's like all we have left is zeros, will stay 0. And so when you do the sliding window past this initial spot, you'll just stay 0. And so in some sense, our matrix isn't just like a random upper triangular matrix. It has this structure that if your sliding window becomes 0, it stays 0. And we'll use this observation sort of to generate an overall curve. So although this convolution can sort of fail us in that it could start producing messages or code words with not very many ones, overall it does a pretty good job. In that, like for a random input, it's unlikely to transition to this quote unquote 0 state. While it's unlikely, it certainly does happen. In that, if you have full freedom over the input, it's quite trivial. You just pick the input so that this sliding window becomes 0. And so this ends up being a problem because we're going to measure our minimum distance as the smallest weight code word, which can sort of, in this sort of setting is easily done. And so one question is like, how could you possibly prevent this? And the idea, and we build on some fireworks, is that we want to add an additional step to the compilation. In particular, we're going to use this thing known as an expander matrix. Here, so our overall code, this will be our overall code. We have this sparse matrix E, which each column has some sort of log weight, log number 1, 0, and 1s. And then that we forwarded into this convolution. And so the intuition, at least, is that this expander will take this X message and sort of expand it into a larger message. But because you're expanding it in this random way, you don't have full control over the expanded X. Maybe you could set the first so many positions to be whatever you want, but the second half of it might be sort of out of your control. And if we combine this with our intuition about when does the convolution fail us, well, the convolution fails us when you're able to exactly control the input so that the convolution transitions to the 0 state quite often. But by combining these two things, you kind of get these two matrices to work against each other. One expands, you lose some control, and then the convolution sort of is able to take advantage of this. And in this way, we show that it's very unlikely that the convolution will output only a few number of inputs. So while this was sort of the intuitive approach that I thought would be useful during the talk, the actual proof of having high minimum distance follows slightly different approach in that we model this convolution as a walk on a Markov chain. And then the result of the X times this expander as sort of our state transition equation. And by doing this, we show that when you're walking on the Markov chain, you spend very little time with this so-called 0 state, which is just a different way to say what I just said. Anyways, the proof is quite cool, in my opinion. So if you like the Markov chains, yeah. So what about the concrete efficiency of this thing? The convolution, right? We're just doing this sort of sliding windows of linear equations. And so this is extremely cache efficient and can be implemented very efficiently in hardware, just using a sort of sliding window approach. The main cost in our construction is actually this expander. Although it's not very much work in a theoretic sense, when this thing's like in a computer, these you're doing like random accesses over a length of a million, and you're doing n log n of them, and so that adds up. And so basically, all of our running time is just spent in this expander multiplication. There was a previous work here last year, expand and accumulate, and there, given the similarities in titles, you'd think the construction would be similar. right. The only difference is instead of doing a convolution, they do an accumulate, which is a type of convolution where it's just like a all ones upper triangular matrix. And in some sense, their convolution is not as powerful as ours, not as sort of mixing as ours. And due to this, their expander has to pick up the slack. And so their expander ends up needing to be much higher weight and also has a worse rate. So it's sort of skinnier and wider, which is not a good thing. It's not so hard given the conversation. I said, oh, our convolution is very fast, making their expander worse. It just sort of hurts their performance. But they also achieve approval minimum distance. Yeah. So in addition to this, they also proposed, as do we, some sort of so-called aggressive parameters. And these aggressive parameters sort of like take intuition from the proof, but sort of try to make things a little bit more efficient. And we show that some of their aggressive parameters might have been a little too aggressive. It happens to the best of us. But yeah, not that we broke their construction or anything, but there was some. Let's see the paper. On the other hand, there was another prior work. This one was by myself, and it, although presented in that paper slightly differently, essentially it looks sort of very similar, except for this E matrix, instead of being expander, has this sort of very aggressive structure, and they experimentally validated this design using sort of heuristic methods to estimate the minimum distance. Unfortunately, me was wrong, and that this thing doesn't have minimum linear minimum distance. Instead of it's like polylog of some sort. Basically, we're being too aggressive, so don't use the silver codes anymore. Yeah, I want to say that. So shown here is the sort of minimum distance performance of our code versus this expand accumulate. So the y-axis is the sort of security parameter to obtain some fixed minimum distance, and then the x-axis is the how expensive is the expander. So you can see for like any fixed expander, our code performs sort of several orders of magnitude better. So, and this is all just comes down to using better convolution. And our code, yeah, also achieves a better rate, as I mentioned. You can also look at the running time. So, shown the top line, the red one is sort of an older code that uses quasi-cyclic codes. But the green one is the expand and accumulate. And so you can see that their code is gets quite a bit higher running time. And so these lines are sort of hard to compare because they get different minimum distance, but like a good comparison between the two is that the expand accumulate that takes 740 milliseconds compares to our 190 milliseconds. So we're like 4 times faster due to this better, not needing as expensive. Sorry. Yeah, so with that,
Right.
this is the name of the game. You just see that that's a strict requirement. But the question is like how much? Yeah, I think you certainly can do better than this. There are some papers out there that theoretically do better, but I think it's a matter of like concrete distance and yeah, trying to find the right combination in a second. Yeah, so the offline online mode, it's like the idea is that you can run the first setup phase and then this accumulate phase, which is sort of efficient. And then on demand, you can sort of do the expansion, the expander one by one. You don't have to do it monolithically. I think it's a nice observation which can be useful in various settings, but it seems that like you have to keep this in memory, and then like you have quite a bit of memory, and maybe it just makes sense to like, so when you get the final correlations, they're going to be less memory. So maybe it makes sense to sort of compress these things down. This is especially true when you're doing like binary OLEs. There you have to like keep, so for this part, you have like a 128-bit values, and then you compress them down to 1-bit values. So it's like if you don't compress these OLEs, you're taking around like a 256-bit overhead of storage, which can be quite a bit in some settings. So yeah, I often think about it as end-to-end, but yeah, if you have tons of storage, yeah, like in terms of running time, well, it's I'd say if you count the holistic thing, it's maybe a third to get to the convolute and then 2/3 to compress. If you count end-to-end.
Okay, great. I see no other questions, so I guess I'll earn our coffee break. Thank you, Peter. Really, that's what it's very cool. It's hard to kind of look at the slides and follow this. So that part, sorry.